ICAHD has always been political. I mean, we've done activist stuff forever. We build houses, we resist demolitions, we're out protecting Palestinian communities, working with farmers, uh, plus all our advocacy. I mean, we do all that. But, we understand that activism and all the specialized kinds of programs and campaigns we have aren't really enough. There really has it's We're in a political struggle, and there has to be a political organization and political leadership and political strategy and certainly a political program, all of which are kind of missing. In other words, we have a kind of a movement, and a very important and huge movement all over the world for Palestinian rights, of course. Um, but I think it suffers from a lack of coordination, and certainly, a lack of coordination here in Palestine with Palestinians, also with, I think, anti-Zionist Israelis like me. I wrote an article in 2005 that was called Paralysis in Palestine. And one of the real underlying issues that I think we have to talk about a little bit is the fact that the Palestinian struggle has to be led by Palestinians here in Palestine, certainly. But, the Israel and the United States in particular, Britain helped out, certainly, Blair and the gang, have created a situation in which the Palestinians politically find themselves very paralyzed. The first thing was Oslo, of course, that transformed an anti-colonial struggle for liberation in Palestine into a kind of a conflict resolution. The sides would sit down, they negotiate. And of course, that could never really happen because Israel is so tremendously superior to the Palestinians as a state and occupying power in terms of power. So there was no actual ability. Palestinians had no leverage in those kinds of talks, especially since Israel and the United States took the negotiations of Oslo out of the whole context of international law. In other words, the United States reclassified the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza as disputed territory, not occupied territory. And that's the American position until today, which basically pulled the rug out from under the Palestinians because, one of the sources of leverage they had was international law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, conventions against the crime of humanity, against the crime of apartheid. There's all kinds of international covenants and treaties, and especially the Fourth Geneva Convention, that supports the Palestinians' rights. So if, in fact, they win the negotiations in Oslo with international law as the basis of the negotiations, or one of the bases, Palestinians would have won. And the Israelis knew that, and that's why they got the United States to withdraw international law as a reference point in negotiations, making it all power negotiations in which the Palestinians, of course, had to lose. And the second part of the paralysis process was creating the Palestinian Authority, specifically as a kind of a Bantustan type collaborationist regime whose job was to govern actually not exactly govern, but in a sense to govern the Palestinians in the sense that, Israel doesn't have to do that. Israel doesn't have to invest money in teachers and a school system and sewage and municipal things, and everything goes into governance and so on. It frees Israel of that. But at the same time, of course, the PA became Israel's main security arm. Palestinians all these years have talked about living under two occupations, the Israeli occupation and the Palestinian Authority occupation. And so that has created a sense of paralysis among Palestinians. In other words, every leader that emerges, whether the person is 12 years old or 14 years old or 50 years old, is either killed or imprisoned. So there is a leadership. There's a very vibrant political leadership in Palestine itself, but it's not able, even inside Israel, in which the Palestinian citizens of Israel used to have a little more latitude for speaking out and organizing, that pretty much is gone as well. And at the same time, the PA took over and basically dismantled the PLO. So there is no more political vehicle of liberation. There's no political program of the Palestinians. I mean, if you ask the Palestinian Authority, they still accept the two-state idea, which we all know is nothing less than apartheid. But that's their job. They don't have themselves the latitude, and they knew this from the beginning, of being a genuine political actor. The Palestinian Authority, they're under Israeli control, and so if you take it all together, there's a paralysis in Palestine. And part of and since I'm here, I want to bring you a little bit into what's happening inside. In other words, I know you're there, and really your job is to empower the Palestinians, to give the support to the Palestinians as much as possible, to do in the UK through campaigning and education and lobbying and all the great things you all do, BDS and so on, to support the Palestinians in that way. But at the same time, I think it's important, if we want to be political actors, at some point we have to think about how can we empower the Palestinians in the sense of breaking out of this paralysis, trying to empower grassroots leaders and organizations and initiatives to try to support the Palestinians in terms of returning to an anti-colonial struggle. Because the fatal mistake that the PLO made under Arafat was to abandon in 1988, but it was a process for 15 years before that of abandoning an anti-colonial struggle and adopting this conflict resolution idea. And that locked them into this lose-lose equation of having to negotiate everything, having to compromise on all their rights, and basically disempowering them completely. So I think part of the challenge is to return to an anti-colonial struggle. That means, we'll talk about this, I think the political program has to be one democratic state that replaces Israel and the occupation. Equal rights for all citizens of that living in the country, the right of the refugees to return, of course, and addressing Palestinian national rights within that state as well. We can talk about it later if you want to talk about that. So that's a part of it. In other words, we have to come back to an anti-colonial struggle, and so we're caught in a threefold dilemma. On the one hand, there's an urgency here to return to a real struggle to empower the Palestinians to lead it, because you're not going to liberate Palestine from the UK, But at the same time, you've got this paralysis brought on by the United States and Israel and the PA that prevents them from returning to the struggle. And at the same time, you've got this process of normalization going on. The Abraham Accords, everything that's happening on that level that really threatens the Palestinians, because if Israel de facto or in fact is able to normalize, at least de facto, if not all the Arab countries recognizing it, that really closes down in many ways the Palestinian struggle, because there's very little political space after normalization. So what I'm saying is we're caught in a bind between this paralysis on the one hand and the urgent need to empower Palestinians in their struggle, and at the same time, a timeline. I mean, this isn't a conflict, as it's called. Even Palestinians use that term. This isn't a struggle that's going to go on forever. Settler colonialism, I'll turn to this in 1 second, has a timeline to it. It has an end game, which is normalization. And we're up against that kind of a timeline. So let me just, this will be the lecture part. Let me just bring you into the question that I think is a question we have to answer and we have to address. Where are we in the struggle? Now, one of my concerns, of course, is that we use the term settler colonialism, but we don't really understand it. We don't really use it. We use it as an accusation. We use it as a slogan. Zionism instead of colonialism. All right, I've said that. Now let's go on to whatever we're going to talk about. But it's a very important concept. And without that concept as your conceptual framework, to really get the big picture of what the struggle is and where we are in it and what has to be done, you can't be strategic. You don't really know where you are. And I think that's part of the problem. I think people think somehow that this is just going to go on forever. And, again, settler colonialism has a process to it. So let me turn here to a slide that I prepared, a very super slidey, confusing kind of a thing. Are the pictures here blocking the screen? Well, I don't know. Who can answer
I can see I can see most of it.
All right, but I don't know how to get rid of the pictures. Malcolm sort of.
Okay, now I can see the full slide, Jeff.
Can you? Okay.
Okay, now.
All right, let's just go over this quick. This is the big picture. Where are we in the struggle? This slide tries to define the struggle and what the big dilemmas are. So give me a couple minutes to go through it, okay? And I think you'll find it useful. And of course, we're willing to share all these materials with you as well. So this really shows the process of Zionist settler colonialism on the left versus the struggle for Palestinian liberation on the right. And there's a structure and a process and a logic to all of this. Zionism is a settler colonial project, which means its end game is to erase a country called Palestine, erase any Arab Palestine and replace it with a Jewish Israel. It means taking the land, displacing the population, replacing the Palestinian population with its own Jewish population, and erasing completely any cultural presence of Palestinians in the country, so that to change all the place names, you basically try to erase the Palestinian presence and replace it so that the end game is Judaization. Now, that's a really important word. This is the very essence of Zionism, but it's a word we never use. What you're going to see in this kind of a little presentation is that the basic concepts that we should be using to grasp what's going on, we don't use at all because, well, you're not academics, so you're not expected to do that. But that should be our job as academics, is to help people use the right terms and vocabulary and analyses. So Judaization is the key. Judaization means transforming an Arab Palestine into a Jewish Israel. And the flip side, of course, of Judaization is de-Arabization. You can't Judaize the country without de-Arabizing it. So right there, you've got exactly the essence of Judaism, of Zionism, which means you conquer and settle all of historic Palestine. You establish, a Jewish colonial regime of control in its place, and you eliminate the Palestinian presence. Now, Judaization, and of course, de-Arabization in particular, has genocide built into it. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised that we should be outraged, but we shouldn't be surprised, at the genocide, because you can't throw a people out of their country and take the country away and make it another country without genocide, because, as we see on the right-hand side, the indigenous population has to resist. You can't have a process of Judaization, de-Arabization, settler colonialism without resistance. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Now, what's really important here, these reddish, pinkish areas are underlying processes that we really have to understand, kind of underlying realities. The first one is, from what I've just said, there is no political solution to this. It can't be negotiated. It's not a conflict with two sides. Settler colonialism, Zionism is unilateral. The country was invaded. There was never a conflict between Palestinians and Jews in any way. And therefore, and since The very purpose of Zionism is Judaizing all of Palestine, making all of Palestine Jewish. There is no basis for negotiations or compromise. So this is the problem. All the years and years and years of negotiations we've gone through, from the Rogers plans down to the roadmap, to Oslo, to Kerry's negotiations, to the Wide Plantation. I mean, it's hard to think of them all, are all doomed to failure. And in fact, nobody really expected them to succeed because Israel has nothing to negotiate. It's a zero-sum game. This country is ours, say the Zionists. It's ours. It will be ours. That's the purpose of our being here. And that's it. And our job is to eliminate the Palestinians. Until today, Israel does not recognize the Palestinian people as a people. And so that's the first thing. We have to tell everyone that tries to say, let's engage in a political process. Let's go back to negotiations. There is no such thing. Israel will play at negotiations, of course, but this is a zero-sum game. Now, after you settle the country and de-Arabize it and Judaize it, as has already been done, Israel already controls the entire country. There really is one state, one apartheid state today. What the second stage is pacification. You have to pacify, in a military sense, the population, because where you want to get to, the third stage, the bottom, is normalization. That's how settler colonialism wins. Normalization means we get rid of the Arabs, or we confine them to little tiny islands. And I say the Arabs because that's the term Israel uses instead of Palestinians, because it doesn't recognize a national people that are called Palestinians. And so you de-Arabize, you Judaize, you settle, and so on. And then that reality that is basically apartheid, because Israel today controls more than 90% of the territory of Palestine, and the Palestinians, who are half the population, besides all the refugees, but today they're half the population between the river and the sea, are confined to less than 10% of the territory. Area A, even Area B is being settled now and taken over by settlers. So in order to get to this normalized apartheid, you have to pacify the population, meaning you have to break every hint of resistance. Because, Netanyahu talked about total victory in Gaza, and everybody laughed at him. What do you mean total victory? There's no such thing. Even the army laughed at him. And they said to him, what do you mean? We're going to kill all the Hamas until there's one lone guy sitting on the roof shooting? Is that what you really mean? Which sounds genocidal. And yes, that's exactly what Netanyahu means, because Netanyahu does understand this. He may be evil, he may be corrupt, whatever you want to say about him, but he's bright. And he's one of the few that gets what I'm talking about now. And he said over and over and over again that normalization is the whole point of Gaza. It's the whole point of the war in Iran. It's the whole point of going over Hezbollah. It's the whole point of the Abraham Accords is normalization. This is how settler colonialism wins. It gets normalized. Okay. But if there is one Hamas fighter on a roof shooting, that's not normal. So you have to get to industrial quiet. You have to break resistance in order to get to normalization, which means genocide in Gaza, the Gazification of the West Bank, especially the military attacks on the refugee camps in the north. And it also means then abroad. What are the other bastions of resistance to Israel? Externally, Iran and Hezbollah. So Trump has no idea why in the hell he's in Iran, but Netanyahu does. Netanyahu has a very clear agenda, and it fits into pacification and normalization. So just to finish this one piece, then, now here's where this is exactly where we're at a crossroads, and this is an open question. There's three possibilities. If you look at the Zionist and the Israeli assumptions, Netanyahu, it used to be that even until, if you think of 2002 and the Arab Peace Initiative, the idea used to be we have to deal with the Palestinian issue And then, yes, we, the Arab world, are willing to normalize with Israel. First, the Palestinians, in the Arab peace initiative that Saudi Arabia initiated. The idea was that, Israel will do this and this and this, and then we will normalize. But what Netanyahu feels that he's discovered, certainly in the last 10 or 15 years, is the opposite logic. And that is that by serving the hegemons, which has always been a strategy of Zionism, the United States, Europe, the major Arab states in the region, and so on, by serving the hegemons, Israel can complete and normalize its Judaization and the Arabization of Palestine without dealing with the Palestinians. In other words, the idea is there are so many common interests between Israel and these Arab states. Israel supplies them with arms. Israel protects them against Iran and the Houthis and so on. Israel gives them the technologies of repression of their own populations, because these are all autocratic regimes. Israel is the gateway to the United States. So if the UAE wants F-35, fighter jets, it has to go through Israel to get to the United States. You see, Israel supplies technologies. In other words, the whole idea is that Israel can be the military hegemon that works closely with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the others to be the military hegemon alongside their economic hegemony. So that's the assumption. And that's why normalization seems so easy, so clear, so doable for Netanyahu and Trump. This is why the Abraham Accords seem to mean something, because you've got so many common interests. And what do the Palestinians bring to the table? I mean, they have no leverage whatsoever. So they're completely marginalized. Normalization is imposed. It's not a negotiation. It's the United States, it's Israel, it's the Arab states that impose it, and it'll impose a paralysis. So the first question is this true? Now, so far, I've been writing that this is pretty true. I think there's a lot of water. It holds a lot of water. But what's happened, I think, in the last few months, especially since since February, the attack on Iran, is that Israel has become so wild and so out of control and so vicious in its destruction that it really has scared the Arab states. I mean, if you're going to be a military, an economic hub in the world, if you're Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so on, the last thing you want is a crazy military superpower running around and attacking Qatar. Now, attacking everybody, that's out of control. So I think Israel has stepped over the boundary. And that could be an opening for us and for the Palestinians in that that could really hold back the normalization process. The Arab countries might say, no, we're not going to normalize with you because you scare us more than and you're more destabilizing the region than you're helping. So that's the second issue. And that's something we should look at. The third issue is paralysis. And that's why I have it in red here. The biggest danger of all is to be in the situation we've been in for the last, since really 1967. In other words, with all the little things going on, negotiations here and there, and talks here and there, and whatever, basically Israel's been left alone to continue its Judaization process. Its settlements have gone on without real criticism here and there, but no real pushback. Israel is a part of the international community. Israel knows there will be no meaningful sanctions on it. And so basically it can do whatever it wants to do. And there is no political process. And that's where it's bad for the Palestinians, because that means that they're going to be stuck in a situation where Israel can expand and attack as long as it wants to, because there is no more political process. And in some ways, Israel would like to get into normalization, but you know what we have now? What we have now is de facto normalization. All right, Saudi Arabia hasn't signed. Syria hasn't signed onto the Abraham Accords. So what? De facto trade is going on, arms trade is going on. Israel's being treated as a part of the region. And so, that's good enough. I have that in the bottom here in the red. The big danger for Palestinians is the good enough solution. Two states, it's apartheid, but who's going to look at the map? Who's going to look at the fine print? And and so I think this is the third part. It's not, in a way, Israel also doesn't normalize officially, but it's good enough. And the Palestinians are really stuck in a managed apartheid regime. All right, give me 2 more minutes.
2 minutes.
Okay, so if we go to the other side then of this equation, the Palestinians, since the beginning of the 20th century, have resisted this settler colonial movement. There was foundational resistance before World War I. There was more organized national and religious-based resistance afterwards, including the 1936 Arab Revolt, of course. Then there was resistance to occupation with the PLO and so on. And then what the PLO did that I mentioned, that was this, I think the fatal mistake, was in 1988, this shift from an anti-colonial struggle to conflict resolution. Oslo, the PA, all depended on negotiations where Palestinians aren't even part of the negotiations, and normalization are not negotiations. They're imposed. So the Palestinians are really in an apolitical situation, almost, of paralysis. So here's where we get to the underlying thing in pink here, or red, that on the Palestinian side, what do the Palestinians have to do now? They have to summon power. They have to somehow find a way back to the table. They have to find whatever leverage they have. They have to, and certainly you in the international community are part of that leverage. I mean, that is a tremendous movement for Palestine, but without a political program, without a Palestinian leadership in this, you're paralyzed because you can't advocate for a political solution without the Palestinians. They have to be the ones that decide that. So there has to be a return to an anti-colonial struggle. Somehow the PA has to be either co-opted or changed or replaced, or a PLO. There's been all kinds of discussions, but of course the PA is supported by the United States and Israel, and so that's very hard. But without that, civil society is paralyzed and not able to work. And we have to stop the normalization process, and we have to assert Palestinian rights before any kind of normalization, of course, and then mobilize all of you. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this paralysis. I believe, and I'll end on this, that the Palestinians do have the power if they organize and we help empower them and give them some protected space to come together in order to organize and articulate a political program. They do have the clout in the end to liberate themselves from Israel. Israel is not in a strong position, as we all know. It's very vulnerable, and we can work on that vulnerability, of course. But you can't have when the ANC had its campaign to collapse the regime, the apartheid regime in South Africa, with BDS and all kinds of other ways, it was able to do that because it had an end game. People knew where it was going. One person, one vote. You can't collapse the Israeli regime and just leave everything and then start to scramble what's next. Nobody's going to allow the Israeli regime to collapse unless it's collapsing or being folded into or replaced by something better. And that something better is one democratic state that Palestinians, together with quite a few Israelis, I really believe, would advocate for. And so we can get to liberation and a post-colonial future and so on. We can do that. We haven't lost it all, but we have to deal with the fact that we're fighting a colonial project, that it has its logic and its timelines, and we have to understand the source of Palestinian paralysis as well, and then within this framework, really sit down among ourselves, but especially with Palestinians, and really say, okay, this is where we are in the struggle. Where we are here are these two black circles. Israel is between pacification and normalization. The Palestinians are between a shift to an anti-colonial struggle and liberation, with all these major pink issues kind of in between that are still open-ended. And so I think if we understand this and begin to play with it and use it strategically, this kind of a concept, I think it'll really help us to be strategic and find ways to empower the Palestinians, maybe more than we have until now.